week, the CIA director called China a silent partner in Putin's war of aggression in Ukraine. Is the U.S. giving any consideration to increasing the nature of its diplomatic pressure on China, changing its tactics in order to bring the Chinese around to ending their tacit support for Russia?
Well, the PRC is going to make its own decisions about how it supports Russia's brutality against the people of Ukraine. The PRC is going to make its own decisions about whether everything that it has purported to stand for in the international system in recent decades, including an emphasis on state sovereignty and the ability and the inviolability of borders, or whether all of that was just a show, just bluster. And to the director's point, not only have we not seen the PRC condemn, as every country around the world should, the brutality that Russia's forces are carrying out on the Ukrainian, against the Ukrainian people. We've actually heard senior PRC officials parrot some of the worst, some of the most dangerous propaganda that is and has emanated from the Kremlin. So this is a choice for the PRC to make. The point that the United States and our European allies and our partners around the world have made to the PRC, a couple. Number one, we are going to continue to keep a careful eye, a careful watch on the level of support for the PRC exhibits towards Russia. Of course, if the PRC were to provide weapons, supplies, would seek to help Russia evade sanctions, there would be strong consequences for that, not only on our part, but also on the part of our allies and partners. But number two, this is a moment when every responsible country around the world has an obligation to its people and to the international community to make clear where it stands on questions that are fundamental and questions on which there should be no nuance. Questions about whether this type of brutality, these wanton human rights abuses, the massacring of civilians, the ability of a state to pretend that international borders don't exist, and the ability of leaders to declare, as President Putin seemingly has, that another country doesn't have a right to exist. These are fundamental questions. We've heard from the PRC its desire over the course of many decades to be a responsible stakeholder. Well, now is the time to answer that question, and now is the time to show up.
Just to clarify, Ned, because you mentioned some of the other ways that China could be providing material support, has the U.S. to date seen any evidence that that support has been anything but rhetorical? Have there been weapons support provided? Has there been sanctions support provided?
We're going to continue to watch very closely. We offered an assessment a couple weeks ago now that we had not seen the provision of weapons of supplies, and that assessment has not changed.
Is the U.S. concerned by reports that 4 Uyghur Muslims held in Saudi Arabia risk deportation to China, and has this been discussed with Saudi counterparts?
Across the world, we advocate against the involuntary return of predominantly Muslim Uyghurs and members of other ethnic and religious minority groups to the PRC. We know that if returned, these individuals are at risk of detention, potentially even torture. We will continue to urge partners to abide by their obligations under international law, including non-refoulement, and not return individuals from vulnerable populations to the PRC where they face genocide and crimes against humanity.
China is a special representative for North Korea's nuclear program, opposed additional UN Security Council sanctions on North Korea, and retaliated that the US and North Korea should resume early dialogue. What is your comment? China always say that they need dialogue, resume the dialogue, but they not help. They not roll over the,
Well, when it comes to the latter element, that's also been our point. We have made very clear that the door to diplomacy, the door to dialogue remains open. We have signaled that publicly, we have signaled that privately, but as I just detailed, the DPRK has yet to engage on those suggestions. We have engaged not only with our close allies, Japan and the ROK, but also with other stakeholders, including regional stakeholders. And of course, the PRC is an important regional stakeholder. We recently had a meeting with the PRC's special envoy for the DPRK. It's important that we continue to engage partners like the PRC on this, given that the PRC does wield a good degree of leverage with the DPRK.
I just wanted to follow up on something you mentioned at the top, the trip involving Assistant Secretary Crittenbrink to the Pacific. Is there anything sort of more concrete you can that delegation is going to be trying to get out of those visits? And wonder if you could sort of, I don't think the announcement mentioned China, which is obviously the backdrop to these visits. How much does this visit reflect a concern that China is growing in influence in that region?
Well, these are three important Pacific partners of the United States: Fiji, Papua New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands. It's precisely why the Secretary met with the Pacific Island Forum earlier this year when we were in the region. And you're right that the announcement doesn't mention China, because at the end of the day, our policy is not about China or any other country. It's about the partnership that the United States can bring. And part of our engagement, including in this upcoming context, is to ensure that our partners in the Indo-Pacific and around the world understand what the United States brings to the table, understands what partnership can bring, and we'll leave it to them to contrast what we offer from what other countries, including rather large countries in the region, might offer.
On the Indo-Pacific trip of the U.S. delegation, is the Solomon Islands intend to sign a security pact with China a concern, and is it going to be brought up on that trip? Is the U.S. delegation going to possibly ask the Solomon Islands not to sign that pact like Australia?
Well, we understand that the Solomon Islands and the PRC are discussing a broad security-related agreement building on recently signed police cooperation. Despite the Solomon Islands government's comments, the broad nature of the security agreement leaves open the door for the deployment of PRC military forces to the Solomon Islands. We believe that signing such an agreement could increase destabilization within the Solomon Islands and will set a concerning precedent for the wider Pacific Island region. We note that Australia and New Zealand have had long-standing law enforcement and security ties with the Solomon Islands. At the request of Prime Minister Sogavare, an Australia-led multinational peacekeeping force from Fiji, New Zealand, and Papua New Guinea effectively restored calm to Honiara following the outbreak of violence and rioting in November of last year. This multinational group quickly aided Solomon Islands and effectively supported a rapid return to peace. We've communicated with our allies and partners in the region, including, of course, with Australia and New Zealand, which have expressed concerns about how this agreement may threaten the current regional security paradigm. Part of the task of the upcoming visit will be to share perspectives, to share interests, to share concerns, and I do expect the full range of all of those will be on the docket. And as you know, earlier this year, we also did announce our intent to reestablish an embassy in Honiara on the Solomon Islands as part of that show of engagement, part of that show of U.S. support for the Solomon Islands. And so I do expect when our delegation travels there, they will continue and bring that message with them.